Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Demystifying Goal Attainment Scaling, Personalized Endpoints in FDA Patient-Focused Drug Development. My name is Samaya, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you can contact me by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Ardea Outcomes, who developed the content for this presentation. Ardea Outcomes is a purpose-driven contract research organization committed to enhancing health outcomes through patient-centric research. Their services focus on implementing goal attainment scaling in clinical development, an area of research honed by their founders for over 30 years. They offer a comprehensive suite of products and services dedicated to gas research, including study design, goal inventory development, comprehensive gas training for clinicians, goal quality assurance, and gas clinical data monitoring enabled by proprietary patent-pending gas-focused electronic data capture platform that's GoalNav. At Ardea Outcomes, they shift the focus from what's the matter to what matters most for patients and caregivers in clinical research and care settings. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event, and our first speaker is Shara Chapman. Shara Chapman has a Master in Health Science and Community Health and Epidemiology from University of Toronto and global experience in HIV research with injection drug users. After completing her MBA at London Business School, Shara founded Rasbora Consulting to bridge the divide between the private and nonprofit sectors. For over a decade, Shara guided nonprofits trying to improve their effectiveness, aided multinationals in developing impactful shared value programs, and facilitated multi-stakeholder partnerships. She has lived and worked in Japan, India, the United Kingdom, Vietnam, and Singapore. Shara is a sought-after board member, investor, and mentor in the startup ecosystem in Atlantic Canada. And our next speaker is Gunesh Shivinch. Gunesh Shivinch has a multidisciplinary background with training and research experience in basic and clinical sciences. Gunesh earned her PhD degree in neuroscience from Istanbul University. During her PhD, she had a visiting fellowship at Cornell University, where she completed her dissertation on neural networks associated with social cognition. She continued her career with a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School Department of Psychiatry. During her fellowship, she utilized clinical trial methodology to examine mindfulness training, dependent cognition, and neural function changes. Gunesh joined Ardea Outcomes as a research manager, driven by her passion for patient-centered outcomes research, leading research operations and internal research programs. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass control to our speakers. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started, Shara.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samaya. Welcome, everyone. If you're on the east coast of Canada at the moment, like we are, it's mid-afternoon on the most spectacular day. So hats off to you for joining us. I know we have some people registered from Europe as well, so it's a bit later. And those of us joining us early morning, we appreciate it all. We're also aware that many of you may be watching a recorded version of this, and that's probably a smart thing to have done. So we appreciate you taking the time to take a look as well. So we've got the presentation today divided into a couple of parts. In the first part, I'll give you a quick introduction to our data outcomes and our passion for goal attainment scaling and personalized endpoints. But then I want to just level set for a few minutes and talk a little bit about goal attainment scaling in general, where it came from, how it works, the kind of nuts and bolts of goal attainment scaling. I'm aware that many people joining this webinar already have a thorough understanding of goal attainment scaling, and others may really have only heard of it recently and not know very much. So I'll give a brief overview, not trying to take up too much time, and a little bit about the benefits as we see them for using goal attainment scaling in clinical development in particular. And then once that's done, we'll pause for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions about goal attainment scaling in general. And then we'll get into the details of goal attainment scaling in patient-focused drug development. It's mentioned in the recent draft guidance, and then talk about the important aspect of standardizing the implementation of goal attainment scaling in clinical trials. And then we'll have time at the end, as usual, for more questions. So I'll just launch into the first bit about us. So as Sumaya said, we're a contract research organization. We were originally founded by my co-founder, Dr. Kenneth Rockwood. He's a world-renowned geriatrician, Alzheimer's disease, dementia expert, and in addition, the creator and inventor of the mathematical model for frailty. So he's a very big thinker. And he originally started using goal attainment scaling in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials in the mid-90s. And was enamored with the method, which wasn't developed by us. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, and sought to bring it to the pharmaceutical space in clinical trials, and founded a company to do that in early 2000s. So once he did that and got us started, I got involved about 6 or 7 years ago, and then we really tried to ramp up the company to bring this to more people and get goal attainment scaling embedded into more clinical trials. So we're a small contract research organization. We have roots in the east coast of Canada, which is where our sort of head office is, but we're a remote first company and employ people from all over Canada. And as Sumaya said, we have a suite of products and services and research services as well to implement goal attainment scaling in clinical trials. So enough about us. What is goal attainment scaling? Actually, there's a bit of our experience with it, but I'll get to that later. Goal attainment scaling, I'm just going to go through the basics for you, back to our agenda, and then get into some of the benefits of it in clinical development. So goal attainment scaling measures the extent to which a patient's individual goals are achieved with intervention. And this is what we mean by a personalized outcome. By design, the goals are meaningful to the patient. And you'll hear me too, I apologize. I use subject, patient, participant, and sometimes even caregiver, because they're sometimes the participant, interchangeably throughout this presentation. It's the person who's actually setting the goals for treatment, the person for whom we're trying to have a therapeutic intervention, the person who's experiencing the issues that we're trying to solve for. So when we say personalized endpoint, our group is also fond of calling goal attainment scaling an individualized endpoint. Same thing. It's really focused on the person. The goals that are set are relevant to them. So at a base level, goal attainment scaling captures what's important to the participant. So that's really important to highlight. It's very basic process on the surface. It's essentially 3 steps. The first is that you identify the goals for treatment, and then you quantify a scale for each goal, and then you go back in time and measure whether the goals have actually been achieved or not. But there's a few things that I want to call out in the process that I think are really important and that people get confused about when they talk about goal attainment scaling as a patient-reported outcome. That's often how it's labeled in the literature. It's really tricky. We don't think that goal attainment scaling is exactly a patient-reported outcome. It's definitely not a clinician-reported outcome either. We call it a patient-centered outcome. So it's clinician-facilitated, and that's really important. The patient is the person who's identifying what the goals are that they would like to set. They are the person who's talking about what the issues are that they would like to see improved by treatment. They are the person who gets to say what's important to them. Even if there are 25 things with respect to their disease that are issues for them, they may only want to hone in on a few of them that they actually want to see impacted by the treatment. And it's really up to the clinician to listen to the patient and understand what's important to them. That is the basis starting point for the clinician facilitated interview. So the patient comes with what's inherently meaningful to them, but the clinician has the tricky job of helping them figure out how to set SMART goals. And that's a really important aspect of it that we'll get to later. So the clinician sits down with the patient, and together they set the goals for the patient for treatment. And then once they've set the actual goal and decided on it, let's say it's a functional goal and a mobility goal, and the participant would like to be able to go from only being able to walk for a short distance to being able to walk for a couple of kilometers, something like that. Once they've decided on what the goal is, then they actually build a GAS scale around it. And once that scale is set, it's a quantitative scale that allows you to come back at follow-up and measure whether the goal has been attained or not. So you refer back to that quantitative scale that was set at baseline to decide on how to rate goal attainment. So this is what it looks like visit by visit. In a goal setting visit, you might have a simple scale like this, where your baseline status is decided and written out at -1 level. Your goal is articulated at the 0 level, and then you also write in detailed descriptions of what would be better than that, and you also allow for the possibility of decline, and you write in what would be worse than that. So this is all established at goal setting visit, at the baseline visit. For usually we would recommend 3 goals. So you do this 3 times for 3 goals, and then at the follow-up visit you come back. It's still clinician facilitated. So the subject may actually go through and rate their own attainment, give the number to the clinician, and the clinician would write that down verbatim, exactly like the subject said. The clinician can also provide their own rating, whether it's the same or different from the subject, and we offer the ability for them to put some comments in there. This is basically the nuts and bolts of how goal attainment scaling works. So let me get into a little bit why we think goal attainment scaling is so great. So really, there are many things you can get from goal attainment scaling. I sometimes joke that it's a bit of a workhorse as an outcome measure. You get more than just one thing from it. So at a very basic level, even if you never do any follow-up, if you sit down and talk to a patient at baseline and do a formal interview and take the time to work with them and understand, like I said, if they have 25 things that are issues with respect to their disease, but really hone in on what's important to them, you will learn a lot. You'll learn what's important to your patient population. You'll learn about their experience at the moment of their disease. And you'll also be able to just characterize what are the issues of most importance to them, compared to perhaps what people might think in the clinical world and what might have been written up in the literature. We're seeing this a lot right now at the moment in a variety of different epilepsy areas where we're working in genetic epilepsies. And lo and behold, many times when we talk to families and caregivers, what they're highlighting, for example, is not seizures. They're highlighting a whole host of other issues related to quality of life that are more important to the family than the seizure count that people often pay attention to in these types of therapeutic areas. So that's just one example. On the surface, if you just ask people what's important to them, that's very, very helpful and very, very important. But then, of course, if you do develop these quantitative scales, and then over time measure whether or not goals are being achieved, you get a quantitative measure of efficacy. If you can quantify and look at the statistics and compare, for example, a placebo arm to a treatment arm and see that there's a treatment effect based on the fact that the treatment arm, for example, may be achieving their goals at a greater rate, than the placebo arm, then you can see, for example, that the treatment might be efficacious. And it's a very sensitive measure. So we always say that you're likely to pick up an effect if it's there. That's the first order inference of goal attainment scaling data. You get this rich quantitative data to actually see whether a treatment effect is there. But then, if you do see that treatment effect, the interesting thing for me, everybody's a bit biased on the things they like the most about goal attainment scaling, but for me, it's really that next bit that's really important. If there is a treatment effect, where is it coming from? And goal attainment scaling allows you to start to figure that out. So if you do see a treatment effect with goal attainment scaling data, you can look into that data and see where the treatment effect is coming from, which goals were likely to be, or which goals were more likely to be attained, what's actually driving this treatment effect. And it's very rare to be able to do that with a lot of the outcome measures that we currently have included in clinical trials. So this is, I think, one of the reasons why Dr. Rockwood sort of fell in love with goal attainment scaling, using it in early Alzheimer's disease trials. If he was here, he'd be able to give all sorts of great examples. One simple one that he's given many times is a situation where the sponsor wasn't exactly sure how their drug was working, but they thought for sure that even though it wasn't a huge treatment effect, the early Alzheimer's disease drug that was being tested was having a measurable effect, but on memory. And when we were able to dive into the goal attainment scaling literature and take a look at where the treatment effect was coming from, it had nothing to do with memory. And it was very clear that the treatment effects were coming from improved areas of executive function. So it was a huge learning curve for the sponsor to better understand not only that their drug was definitely working, but also how it was working, which was different from what they expected. So it's a bit of a workhorse in that sense. You can get a lot out of goal attainment scaling data. This is a bit of a busy slide. There's a few key takeaways from this, and if you download this, you'll be able to have this and take a closer look at it. We say, again, we're a bit biased, we're very enamored by using goal attainment scaling, not to replace other outcome measures by any means, but to complement them at different phases of clinical development. And we do think there's value in using goal attainment scaling even as early as phase 1. We've been unable yet to convince any of our research partners to do that, and I haven't seen it in the literature, but I do think there'd be value there, especially at the very beginning when, like I said, you may just want to be characterizing what's important to patients in a very robust way. And if you did that, you'd have a very good sense of that after phase 1 to take that into phase 2 and continue along with goal attainment scaling. You could start with some of the things you learned in phase 1 as a starting point for things that patients might be interested in setting goals around for phase 2. And we'll get into that in a minute later when we talk about semi-standardized goal inventories. Normally, we see people using goal attainment scaling in phase 2 or phase 3, most often phase 3. Again, with our experience in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, we often recommended using goal attainment scaling in phase 2. The results, as you all know from a lot of those early trials, were poor or at best kind of wishy-washy. And goal attainment scaling, being a highly sensitive measure of change, usually can pick up any treatment effect if there is a treatment effect there. So using it in phase 2 could be very helpful to make very important and tricky decisions about how and whether to continue on to phase 3. If you look at the literature, most people are using goal attainment scaling in phase 3. That's most of the situation for us, but we have also done work in phase 4. Recently at a couple of rare disease conferences that I've been to, we've been talking about the very difficult issue of developing and using outcome measures all the way along from phase 1 to phase 3 and to get drug approval. But now there's the additional difficulty of once you've done all that hard work and you have this incredible body of evidence, you almost need to start again after approval to create another body of evidence for reimbursement. And so using outcome measures like goal attainment scaling throughout the life cycle may allow you to continue on with the same evidence that you've been collecting, just collecting in a different way post-approval. And goal attainment scaling works very well that way. So we see value in it all the way along, but mostly we see people using it phase 2, phase 3, and sometimes recently in phase 4. It is, again, busy slide, and Ganesh stole this part of it, and she's going to continue on using it later on in the presentation, so you'll hear from her about some of the ways we do this in clinical trials. first of all, we are not the only people doing goal attainment scaling in research by any means, and we are not the only people doing goal attainment scaling in clinical trials. So what we talk about is the way we do it, and we try to make it, it's tricky, we try to make it as robust and what's the right word, rigorous, I would say, as possible in clinical trials. We've seen goal attainment scaling implemented really poorly in some clinical trials, and it's like any other data source. If you implement the method in a less robust way than you could have, you may have difficulty interpreting that data later on. So we try to make the implementation as rigorous and robust as possible without it being overwhelming, and by keeping an eye on efficiency and feasibility in a very busy clinical trial environment. And so we've also seen some other groups doing this too, whether they're CROs or sponsors doing it directly themselves, or even we've seen some academics doing really good quality clinical trials with goal attainment scaling. So some of these things aren't unique to us. In a nutshell, we have 3 buckets of things that we provide to try to make this easy and efficient, as well as rigorous for implementation in clinical trials. The first are research services. So we believe very strongly that goal attainment scaling should be included right away when the protocol is being developed. And if you have time before you even get to that stage, working with the patient population to actually develop a potential list of goals that could be implemented might help in the implementation and also with training. Ganesh is going to talk about those goal inventories in a minute. But we also have a bunch of services around data management and quality assurance, medical writing, and things that we try to offer to make things a little bit easier just for the gas part, because we know a lot about that. I think across the board around the world, everybody interested in goal attainment scaling, even if they're just using it in their clinics and they're not even using it in research, agree universally that training clinicians to do goal attainment scaling is really, really helpful. And we recently participated in a couple of workshops put on by NCQA, where they're actually trying to figure out best practice for training. And there are lots of groups doing really interesting things to help support clinicians on their journey to implement goal attainment scaling in clinical trials. So we have an e-learning platform and a whole GAS course. We also do study-specific modules and things like that. And we try to provide support throughout the trials, and also, attend investigator meetings, update newsletters, do all that good stuff while the trial's happening. I think we were on a bit of an extreme end in terms of our clinical trial desire to implement in a robust way. And we actually went ahead and developed software that we use to have clinicians facilitate goal attainment scaling in clinical trials, and kind of walk them through the process, but also allow us to monitor the data in real time. So we do have technology to go along with that. There are other people who have GAS technology too. From what we've seen so far, I think it's mostly for clinic use, which you can use ours for as well. But there may be some things out there for clinical trials. I'm not 100% sure. So again, we're not alone in implementing goal attainment scaling in clinical trials. We did this a couple of years ago. We took a look at clinicaltrials.gov to actually see what was happening with goal attainment scaling in research and all the trials that were listed on that site. And there were quite a lot. And we found that they were increasing exponentially over time, and getting more and more frequent. Goal attainment scaling was actually invented in the 60s in California for mental health care planning, not necessarily for research particularly. So there are other groups just like us who've really thought there was value in it and started using it for research. As you can see, I think true to its roots, goal attainment scaling was originally conceived in the CNS environment, and a lot of CNS researchers have used it. I touched really briefly at the beginning on a slide that showed some of our experience in goal attainment scaling, and our experience kind of mimics this. Because we started in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, we did move on. We did some rehab work, some hip fracture work. We've done a little bit of work in Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, autism. I'll talk a bit in a minute about some genetic epilepsies where we're working. There's a lot of background that we do have in CNS, but anything chronic and complex is easy to measure and works well with goal attainment scaling. So in recent years, we've also moved a bit more toward rare disease and just other diseases in general out of the CNS spectrum. So we've also done a lot of work in hemophilia, some work in neurogenic bladder and bowel disorders. We've done some work in some rare oncology applications. Most recently, we're just starting a project to get into doing this in muscular dystrophy. So there are lots of different places where you can use goal attainment scaling, and you can see here some of the examples of people using it over time. We'll get to it, but with the recent mention of goal attainment scaling in the draft guidance, I expect that these numbers will start going up even more quickly. We're hopeful. My last thing I want to mention before I do give a little bit of time just for some general goal attainment scaling questions is on the use of goal attainment scaling in rare disease. So there was a critical paper that came out about a year before the draft guidance by some researchers at the Critical Path Institute who mentioned the potential value of goal attainment scaling in rare disease. And we had seen that before by some other goal attainment scaling researchers in the Netherlands who'd also mentioned the potential application of GAS in rare. And we have certainly seen this, as I just mentioned, our experience looking at our move from entirely CNS-related things into a lot of rare disease now. So that's not lost on us. Some of the things that they called out in the Critical Path Institute paper were around some issues of psychometric limitations that existing measures have in rare disease. The obvious one that we see a lot are floor effects. In addition to that, they often include non-relevant items that are in standardized assessments. There's also issues with accessibility of those measures that exist, and then the stability of the outcome that's being measured. We are working with a group of incredible researchers on something called the Inchstone Project in developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. That group is really trying to develop novel outcome measures for the severe DEEs, which you can imagine have issues across the board based on the ones I just mentioned in the paper from the Critical Path Institute. There are floor effect issues, there's issues of accessibility, non-relevant items. There is also the stability of the outcome that's being measured. There's a real issue with that in the severe DEEs. There's massive fluctuations based on all sorts of things from, comorbidities, other infections and issues the child's experiencing at the time, whether they actually had to travel to clinic, all sorts of things. So we're working with this group to adapt existing outcome measures based on the draft guidance 3, which suggested we do just that. And we're looking at bringing goal attainment scaling to that group. So as a first start of that last year, we did do a quick pilot study in SCN2A associated DEEs and tested the feasibility of goal attainment scaling. I don't have a lot of time to get into that now. I can circle back to it if that's an interest, but we have presented on that at the American Epilepsy Society, and we're also developing a paper manuscript on that just now. But it was feasible and much appreciated by the clinicians and the families both to be able to have an outcome measure that actually captured what was important to the patient, but was also clinically meaningful. So we got really good first glimpse at the data from that, which seemed to be very promising. So I'm going to pause there and just open it up, as I promised we would, for a few questions now, just on the basics of goal attainment scaling and some early understanding that we have of it in case people have particular questions about that. I'm going to turn now to my screen over here. I do have some chat questions that are coming in. Let's see. There's a couple questions about goals, which I think might be useful. We often get these questions, especially for good reason, when the sponsor is making a huge investment to do something novel and new. They're often concerned about a couple of things. The first one is, what happens if participants in the trial set goals that are just a little out there? They're either or they're either too difficult to achieve, or they may not be relevant to what the drug could possibly even be able to do. And then the follow-on question to that we always get is, but can't we just select which questions the patients need to set? So if you're goal attainment scaling purists like we are, then you'll see it as no surprise that we say, well, no, you can't do that. You lose the spirit of goal attainment scaling, which really is a personalized endpoint. And at the very fundamental root of it is just a trust in the patients and the caregivers that they know what's most important to them and that they will be able to see, understand, and characterize success when they experience it. And so helping them to set forth what's important to them and how they would know what success looks like is a really important part of the process. So there's an element of trust of working with the patients. I think the real issue is around the fact that it is clinician facilitated, and we highly, highly recommend that, and that comes along with really good training. So the ability of the patient to set crazy goals will be mitigated by the clinician understanding the therapeutic area and understanding the patient. So I use this all the time. I used to run marathons. I have a back injury. If I tried to run a marathon now, my clinician would laugh. It's ridiculous. In my mind, do I want to run another marathon? Absolutely. Am I ambitious and determined? Yes. But if I tried to set that goal today, then she would put me in place and say, Cher, let's work on a 5K. You know, it's been a really long time since you've been able to run in a way that you're used to. So there is a real dance there with the clinician and the patient to make sure that the goals that are set are appropriate. Ganesh will get into this a little bit later, I think, with our approach in clinical trials. There's nothing wrong with suggesting, if you're going to set multiple goals, that maybe some goals should be from certain domains. So recommending, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, that if you're setting 3 or 5 goals for treatment, at least one of them be in the cognitive domain, one of them be in a functional domain, one of them be, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But actually saying like, okay, you need to set this sleep goal now, it defeats the whole purpose of goal attainment scaling. Maybe I'll just do one more question, and then I'll go from there. Well, there's a question about whether it's acceptable to regulators. We're going to get to that because it's just included in the FDA draft guidance. There's a question here about whether there's been any uptake for gas in clinical trials and drug development for infectious disease, such as antimicrobials or antivirals. This is an easy question for me. To my knowledge, no. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, Ganesh.
No, not really.
Yeah, we haven't seen that. That doesn't, again, mean it hasn't been done. So we're also happy to circle back on any of these questions and take them offline. We do have a team devoted to working on all this, so they may also have seen different things in their research that we haven't seen. So we'd be happy to circle back on that. Let's see. We're going to get into these. Some of these questions are coming right up. I'm not going to skip over them. I'm going to pass it over back to Sumaya, I think, and pass it to Ganesh. I'll just give you a characterization. There's one about the acceptability to regulators and FDA, EMA label claims. I haven't seen goal attainment scaling included in any label claims yet. I'm really hoping that's going to change. We've worked in a lot of areas where, unfortunately, starting in Alzheimer's disease, some of the therapeutic indications weren't efficacious and weren't successful. I do think with the change coming forward, with the FDA supporting goal attainment scaling more openly, that we might see a change to that. And then there's some questions here about how you interpret goal attainment scaling data, since the goals are personal. We can get into that at the end. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Sumaya, and Ganesh will launch into the second half of our presentation. We'll check back in again with the discussion at the end.
Hi everyone, Güneş Sevinç here, and I'll be talking about GAS in the Patient-Focused Drug Development Draft Guidance 4 and standardized implementation of GAS in clinical trials. And first of all, this is a glimpse of draft guidances, all 4 guidances. And of course, we are very excited to see personalized endpoints, especially goal attainment scaling in the draft guidance 4. And according to the agency, and right now I'm quoting from an eSports seminar that took place yesterday, and they stated that the purpose of a QoA-based endpoint is to collect information on the aspect of patients' health that's meaningful to them. And statistical significance does not by itself indicate whether the result corresponds to a meaningful treatment effect or not. The agency, and they repeatedly emphasize that they evaluate how meaningful the QoA score difference is from the patient's perspective. And to interpret meaningfulness, the scores need to directly relate to patients' experiences. And personalized endpoints such as goal attainment scaling reveals what's most important to the patient and is therefore inherently meaningful. And currently, it's recommended under the guidance 4, it's recommended as a strategy to implement when the disease affects multiple aspects of feeling and functioning. That is the heterogeneity in diseases, both at the onset and in disease progression. And according to the guidance 4, in these cases, one can use separate endpoints for each aspect of health or construct a multi-component endpoint. However, for both of these 2 cases, the treatment effect may be diluted as patients may differ in terms of the aspect of health that's affected. So one solution to that is the use of personalized endpoints such as goal attainment scaling. And as Sharon mentioned, we are very excited and it has several advantages. First, it's a measure of efficacy. It's highly responsive. And compared to the other standardized measures and or biomarkers, GAS incorporates clinicians' abilities to detect unspecified changes. And clinician involvement is especially valuable for cases where the model of disease severity or the treatment effects are unknown, which is often the case. In these cases, again, standardized measures generally fail to achieve required sensitivity and specificity. You can switch to the next slide. Sorry, neurodegenerative diseases are typical examples. GAS has been commonly used as an endpoint in anti-dementia trials and shown to be better at capturing clinically meaningful effect compared to the other measures, including the clinician-reported ones, such as Clinician Global Impression Scale, CBIC plus the Clinician Interview-Based Impression of Change plus Caregiver Interview, and also the Global Deterioration Scale. To repeat, the main strength of GAS is the robust assessment of change, which is also, by definition, clinically meaningful. As you all know, there is this problem of arbitrary threshold setting. Any decision, such as a responder threshold, need to be predefined and justified through extensive research. Even then, it's somewhat arbitrary as there needs to be standardization and then there's tremendous variance amongst patients. So GAS overcomes the problem of arbitrariness in the definition of clinically meaningful difference and thus lifts the heavy work on the front end. And us asking the patients what does better look like to you will result in a robust understanding of what's important to them. And FDA guidances suggest that the importance of an endpoint to patients and caregivers needs to be justified. And GAS is by definition relevant to the patient, captures patient experience, and again, lifts the heavy work on the front end required to justify the tool. There is also the second order inference that Cher mentioned, and I think this also answers one of the questions about the statistical power. So if there's a treatment effect and if that is detected, analyzing the frequency with which specific goals are achieved or how frequently clusters of goals under domains are achieved has the potential to help elucidate drugs' mechanism of action. And this additional insight into exactly how the therapeutic intervention is working in the target population is unique to goal attainment scaling and currently not mentioned in the current draft guidance. Critically, this second order inference does not need to be limited to the treatment effect. It may include expected or unexpected side effects, drug safety information, and the overall patient experience. I'll be detailing our approach in later slides, but at each follow-up visit, we recommend inquiring about each goal's relevance and meaningfulness to the patient, along with any changes and other potentially newly emergent symptoms, goals, and challenges. Although not analyzed quantitatively, this information can be analyzed qualitatively and may provide additional insights into treatment effects, including expected or unexpected side effects, drug safety information, and more importantly, the overall patient experience. So next slide, please. I have listed the advantages of Goal Attainment Scaling, and here I would like to repeat the 3 that are mentioned by the FDA draft guidance published in April 2023. So according to FDA, also, it reflects how each patient feels, functions with respect to what's most important to them. The data is based on what was identified as an issue by each patient at baseline, so there is no dilution of treatment effect due to mixing affected and unaffected patients. And also, it can be considered along with another endpoint to inform decisions about the effect of a medical product. After listing the advantages, PFDD Guidance 4 warned that the process for eliciting personalized endpoints have the potential for inconsistency, rightfully so, and we most definitely agree with that and suggest that the process to construct a personalized endpoint should be standardized and be consistent across sites and patients. Here, I would like to emphasize that the process, the process should be standardized, but not the goals. And there's a big distinction that some people get wrong is when they force participants to choose from a list of goals. This is not recommended and goes against the entire spirit of Goal Attainment Scaling, which aims to capture patient experience as they define it. So we think standardized implementation is critical, and we achieve this through 3 main areas: goal inventories, patient orientation and clinician training, and also through the use of an electronic data capture platform. I will now detail all of these processes one by one. So goal inventories are a list of goals, symptoms, and challenges. The goal inventory is usually prepared with special consideration to the conceptual model of the disease, with input from the target population, that is patients, caregivers, and also healthcare providers, and informs the conceptual framework for GAS. They are not necessary, as Cher mentioned, but if there's time in advance of a trial, a semi-standardized goal inventory can be developed and used to help with the training and data analysis and interpretation. And this is where goal inventories can come handy for statistical power too. So the lists of items can be lumped into domains, and this will definitely increase statistical power. So the participant does not need to select from this menu, but it may provide them with ideas about the types of goals that can be set. And if there's nothing on the list that resonates with them, they can develop an entirely new goal. And goal inventories are developed from conceptual models, as I said, and they are used in training of clinicians and also in orienting participants to the process of GAS. So during the data analysis phase, the goals set during the trial can be mapped back to the goals in the inventory, and group domains such as cognition, behavior, executive function will be helpful in the interpretation of GAS data, and especially in understanding what's driving the treatment effect at the second order inference level. So we can move to the next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So here's a goal inventory example, and this is actually part of a patient handout, and which is used as patient orientation. And we slightly implemented implemented a slightly edited version in a recent phase 2 trial of XPro in patients with early Alzheimer's disease. And on the right side, you see a glimpse of symptoms that are symptoms, challenges, and goals. And on the left side, you see a patient's introduction, orientation to goal attainment scaling before even the screening and or baseline interview takes place. So this brings me to my second point, the patient orientation and
Just
clinician
one
training.
second. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Thank you. We really think patient orientation and clinician training are key in standardization of gas. We usually utilize some sort of patient caregiver orientation to the goal setting process prior to the screening interview, and recommend specific criteria and qualifications for gas interviewers, such as they need to be working closely with the population in a clinical care context, understand symptoms, disease progression, and we recommend that it's the same clinician who administers the standardized measures, but also is blinded to the results of other assessments. And as I said, the delivery of standardized training to all interviewers and a formal assessment with certification is extremely important. And other groups do this in different ways, but for us, we have an e-learning system with standardized gas modules and a trial-specific module that all gas raters must complete. And another critical action that can be considered a training is goal quality assurance by independent reviewers. So where possible, we implement a two-step goal setting process at two different visits, usually one at the screening visit and one at baseline. Goals are set at the screening visit, and after that, they are reviewed by two independent reviewers using an enhanced SMART goal setting criterion. The reviewers develop unique feedback tailored to each goal scale and also unique to that interviewer. And gas interviewers receive this feedback before the baseline visit and work with the patients to incorporate the feedback and finalize the scales. Of course, we have done this in many ways, but for example, we have reviewed each rater's first patient's goals or all goals for the first 10 to 20 patients in trial. At each visit, again, together with the attainment level of each goal, gas interviewer may inquire about each goal's relevance, meaningfulness to the patient, along with any changes and other potentially newly emergent symptoms. And this provides insights into the overall patient experience. And again, ongoing interviewer support on gas techniques and specialized data monitoring can further ensure the systematized collection of this personalized data. So the third item we recommend is technology, of course. The employment of an electronic data capture platform specifically designed for collecting Goal Attainment Scaling data.
I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks.
This EDC guides clinicians through the goal setting and attainment rating processes, ensures standardization and data monitoring. As Cher mentioned, we don't know of any other EDCs for gas in clinical trials specifically, but there may be others out there. So to summarize, we highly recommend these three items to standardize gas implementation: the goal inventories, patient orientation, clinician training, and an EDC. And in an ideal world, of course, this would require 6+ months before the trial starts to develop the gas plan, to develop a goal inventory, develop the training materials, and configure study-specific EDC. This concludes my presentation, and thank you. Happy for any questions.
Yeah, I think we can just go to the discussion slide, or we can just take that off even if you just want to see us up there, Sumaya. I did have a couple questions we didn't get to. I think Ganesh did answer one of them. There was another question too that we had. So it said, based on what I've read, gas has been mostly applied to neurologic lifestyle diseases. What extent can gas be applied to conditions that don't seem to affect lifestyle or cause a profound physical discomfort that a patient can really notice? So the only thing I can say to this is that in order for goals to be set that can be rated, they need to be measurable. So as long as they're measurable to the patient and or the caregiver, then that's fine. Goal attainment scaling, and we've got a recent publication or manuscript we submitted on this. There's a a whole literature around goal attainment scaling with caregivers. It's been very well utilized with caregivers actually reporting instead of the patient, either individually setting goals for treatment or working with the patient as a dyad to set goals for treatment. So as long as the goals that are being set are specific enough and measurable at the next follow-up visit, then it should be okay. So there have to be some signs and symptoms and issues that are measurable that the caregiver can quantify. The example that I can give most recently we worked through was that one back to SCN2A. And some of the children we were working with were so severely affected by their disease that they had very little function at all. So they may have no verbal communication, no material communication through tablets or other forms, only the most basic communication, possibly even with blinking and other gestures like that. But the caregiver knows what the goals are treatment. The caregiver was able to articulate what the goals for treatment were, and they were goals that he or she could monitor, measure, and evaluate at the time point. So it may not be something that the patient's able to articulate that's going to materially affect their quality of life, but it may be something that the caregiver can set and work with them on and to rate on their behalf at a follow-up time point. We have extensive experience with that in Alzheimer's disease and other areas, but in addition, we're not the only people. Often in rehab and other areas, goal attainment scaling has been used where the caregiver has been the main person reporting on behalf of the patient. So I'm not sure if that answers the question exactly, but there need to be some signs and symptoms. So we always say, if your drug is so good that it's an instant cure and any issue that the person ever had will immediately go away and everything will be perfect, then there's nothing to measure. So it's not the right outcome for that. But otherwise, if there are any signs and symptoms at all, then and they're measurable, then it should be appropriate in that case. There was another question too that we had about evaluating goal quality. So I might just go back to that for a second. And Ganesh did talk through the way that we've done it. I think there are a couple other groups that have done this in really clever and elegant ways too, which we may be able to point you to. There's certainly a research group out of Brisbane in Australia, an academic group that's done some really interesting ways to evaluate goal quality and look at quality assurance of the different goals in real time. As you all know, in a clinical trial situation, this can be really tricky to evaluate goal quality in a robust way, provide meaningful feedback, and have the goals be improved. Just to go back to Ganesh's point before I hand it over to her about the goal quality review, the way we've tried to do that is to separate the goal setting visits at screening and baseline. So at screening, the goal setting visit is started, and then the goal review would happen after that. And then they would have until baseline to finalize those goals before the intervention is given, so that the goal attainment scaling goals are sort of carved in stone before the product has actually been provided to the participant. Did you want to just talk a little bit, Ganesh, about the quality assurance process that we've been using recently?
Absolutely. So the quality assurance, so basically what's happening within the context of a clinical trial is that each patient develops their own scale. So from a psychometrics perspective, there are things that needs to be done for that scale to be valid and reliable. So the review by independent reviewers, assessors, ensures that each scale is unique to each patient and also psychometrically sound. And the two-step dynamic process is critical because it ensures live, on-live feedback that can also be incorporated right away and be part of the clinical trial. Again, most of the criticisms on the FDA's, again, disadvantages mentioned are based on a premise that patients only set one goal. that's not recommended. We recommend multiple goals with a minimum of 3, ranging across several domains. So that, along with quality assurance, robust quality assurance and review of the goals by independent reviewers, I think will ensure that patients and clinicians are together perfectly capable of developing these skills unique to each patient.
That's great. I don't seem to see any more questions rolling in. So just one more thing I want to touch on, because it's like a thing that I always want. It's a small nuance, but it's something that I always want to highlight with goal attainment scaling. So Ganesh did talk about our group's pioneering use of goal inventories, and we have seen this a lot with other groups. We use goal inventories for several reasons, but I think of them mostly as a training tool. So they give the patient the orientation to the goal setting process, and they outline for them some of the types of goals they might want to select. We will also use these sometimes to configure our electronic data capture system, so then the clinician has access to these. And we sometimes use goals from the inventory and create sample goals and things to use for training with clinicians, so they'll understand what we mean by a SMART goal and a robust goal scale, like Ganesh is talking about. But I have to point out the other side of it, which again kind of goes to that second order inference and what you can learn if you're open to it with patients and personalized endpoints. Some of the most valuable lessons that Dr. Rockwood has learned in Alzheimer's disease have come from patients setting goals that he didn't think would be goals. So, for example, in the early days, again, of these trials that he was participating in, there were multiple patients on multiple avenues setting goals around verbal repetition. The most important thing that people were setting that wasn't on any inventory. This was doing open-ended goal attainment scaling back at that time. So they learned so much about what was important to people, and they're able to characterize that. In other cases, they actually gave out a goal inventory, but they always allow people to set goals even if they're not captured on that inventory. And people sometimes set goals for things that people didn't even realize were issues related to that stage of Alzheimer's disease or that stage of dementia. So they were learning as they were going as well, which was really, really important, really interesting to just at a broad level capture the patient experience. So it can be really exciting to hear from people and learn from people if you allow things to be a little more open-ended and not so rigid. We like standardized process, but not standardized goals. So the last question is, and I'll end on that, yes, each patient in the trial can have completely different goals, and that is by design. So again, my goals are different from Ganesh's goals. We may both have a running goal, but they might be completely different. I may have a behavioral goal for my child. She may have a cognition goal for her child, vice versa. That's okay. In the first case, you're actually looking, were they achieved? And then in the second case, you're looking at, well, if they were achieved or they weren't, why is that? What was driving that? And then you dive into what exactly the goals were. So I think that's it. We've wrapped up with most of the questions. I think we've answered many of them. And of course, if you have any other questions at all or you want to connect with us, we'd be more than happy to go into more detail on any of these things. And we did a few webinars a few years ago, and then that COVID thing got in the way. At the moment, we're planning to do many more and to dive into much more detail on some of these issues. So we may in the future have a training webinar, have a goal inventory webinar, have a webinar about quality assurance. So we're going to look into that and see if we can push that forward along the way. But we'd be happy to hear from you if you have any more questions.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. I've also popped that in the chat box, so you can go ahead and take that link down. So that's a link for the webpage, and that's where the recording will be uploaded as well, and you will get an email for that. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers today for that fantastic presentation, Cher Chapman and Gunesh Sevinch. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.